Good evening, I'm Ronald Holsey. Tonight we're going to be discussing the crisis regarding U.S. involvement in Iraq. In recent months, U.S. lawmakers have fervently debated the best course of action to take in the region. Tonight we'll discuss the U.S. diplomacy in the area with guests from the University of California at Davis, the Committee on the Middle East, and the U.S. Senate. They'll all be joining us in just a few minutes, so stay tuned for Shades of Gray. Good evening and welcome back to the April edition of Shades of Gray. Tonight we're discussing the crisis in Iraq. In recent months, the situation in the Middle East has been a precarious one for the United States. However, many feel that the United States has brought the crisis upon itself, and that the situation could have been avoided had the United States handled Middle East diplomacy differently. Some trace the roots of the Iraqi conflict as far back as World War I, when governments were first set up in the Middle East following the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. Many of these governments were unstable and ruled by dictators. Later, in the 1950s, as the world moved into the Cold War, many Mid-East governments formed friendly relations with either the United States or the Soviet Union. These friendships caused much tension in the region and eventually led to a war between Iran and Iraq that lasted from 1980 to 1988. The United States sided with Iraq mainly because of its strained relations with the Iranian government. U.S. support of Iraq continued after the war until Iraq invaded Kuwait in 1990. This action threatened the United States, including interests of the United States allies in the Middle East, such as Saudi Arabia. As a result, President George Bush employed Operation Desert Shield, intending to protect Saudi Arabia. Later, Bush instituted Operation Desert Storm, a campaign to drive Iraq out of Kuwait. Though some feel that these operations were implemented merely to protect the United States allies, others contend that the United States became involved due to economic interests in the area's many oil supplies. During the Gulf War, the United States sanctions and embargoes on Iraq had a devastating effect on the Iraqi population. Some argue that the drastic nature of these sanctions was unwarranted and is a major reason for the current tension between the United States and Iraq. Others consider the actions justified in light of the Iraqi aggression. In the past few months, however, the most frequently debated issue has been the possibility of Iraqi possession of biological or nuclear weapons. After Iraq refused to allow UN weapons inspections earlier this year, many have begun to question the scale and the intent of Iraqi weapons programs. Reports of Iraqi use of chemical weapons in the war with Iran, and further reports of a program to create nuclear weapons, worry many officials. It was for these reasons that the United States sent additional troops to the Middle East earlier this year. Many say that the best course of action would be to go to war with Iraq to prevent the development of such weapons. Since that time, Iraq has agreed to allow UN weapons inspections to take place. This resolution was formed following a visit to Iraq by UN Secretary General Kofi Annan. Still, many wonder about the sincerity of Iraq's intentions and the stability of the agreement. When we come back, we'll be joined by experts from the University of California, at Davis, and the United States Senate to discuss the actions which the United States has taken in the region. Later, we'll be joined by guests from the Committee on the Middle East to discuss further repercussions of those actions. Finally, we'll bring out all four of our guests to debate and discuss the issue, and it should be interesting, so stay tuned for more Shades of Gray. Hello, welcome back to Shades of Gray. I'm your host, Ronald Holsey. Tonight we're discussing the crisis in Iraq. Joining me now in the studio are two experts on relations between the United States and Iraq, and who believe that that Iraq has deserved many of the restrictions imposed upon her following the Gulf War. Starting on my far left from the United States Senate is Mr. Chris Madison, and next to Mr. Madison on my left from the University of California at Davis is Bruce Jennelson. Thank you both very much for being here. To begin, I'd like to give you both an opportunity to tell a little bit about yourself and how each of you are involved in the Iraq situation. We can start with you, Mr. Madison, if you will.
I'm a communications director for Senator Joseph Biden of Delaware. He's the senior Democrat on the Foreign Relations Committee in the Senate and has been involved over the past few years in the U.S. policy towards Iraq and the Persian Gulf.
Okay, Mr. Jennelson.
I'm a professor. I teach international relations. for the University of California, Davis, but I'm here in Washington because we have a teaching and research center that I'm the director of. I've worked on the Middle East a lot. I wrote a book a few years ago that was called With Friends Like These, Reagan, Bush, and Saddam, and it was the story of U.S. relations with Iraq in the period that you described in the 1980s leading up to the Gulf War. In 1993-94, I was in the State Department on what's called the policy planning staff and worked as one of the negotiators in part of the Middle East peace talks, and have continued to be involved in that in a more informal way since I left the government.
Okay. What events would you say were most crucial in leading up to the confrontation over weapons inspections in Iraq?
Well, I think it's a continuing, you have to think of it rather than as a snapshot, as sort of a continuing movie that goes way, way back. And you can even start earlier than the Gulf War, but starting there have been a series of problems that the United Nations passed a whole series of resolutions that Saddam Hussein needed to comply with. And in particular, resolutions dealing with disarming from chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons. For this 8-year period or so since then, Saddam, to no surprise of many people, has done his best to deceive the international community, to lie about it, and more revelations have come out both about what he's done in the past using these weapons. You mentioned one example against Iran during the war. Mm-hmm. He's also used chemical weapons against his own people, the Kurds. Reports indicate he's used human subjects for testing biological weapons. And so there's been a sense, I think, that he hasn't complied, and things have reached the point where it's really in the interest of the rest of the international community that something more be done about this.
And the latest crisis, I think, dates back to the end of last year when he ejected the UN inspectors, specified at some point that they had too many Americans and too many British, and so he began to try to set the terms for the inspections, and not the United States, but the inspectors themselves said that this was unacceptable and came out. That was the beginning of this present crisis.
Okay. What do either of you say a war with Iraq would accomplish?
I don't think anybody wants a war with Iraq at all. I think the question really is, given that Saddam continues to maintain these abilities, and the problem sometimes is it's an abstract thing, a biological weapon. If one were to be released in New York City or Washington or San Francisco next week, there'd be tremendous panic, and unfortunately all too many people would find out how devastating these things could be, and people would then ask, why didn't we do something about it? And the goal, I think, now that we're trying to do is to do something about this before it's too late.
Okay, Mr. Madison, what actions do you think the United States should take regarding Iraq?
Well, I think what we're doing now is about the best you can do. No one really wants to go to war with Iraq because we don't have any guarantee that that would eliminate the weapons. I think what we're doing now is keeping the pressure on and trying to keep as much of a monitoring on so that we can try and minimize his danger to the region, to our allies, and to our interest in the region. But there's no real silver bullet by any means. It's just a question of trying to keep the pressure on him and limit the damage that he can do to his neighbors and our allies in the region.
Okay. Mr. Johnson, what weapons capabilities would you say that Iraq has as of now?
The most serious concerns now are about three things. Biological weapons, which, unlike a nuclear weapon, which requires a major launching capacity, can be used by terrorists. They can be used on a handkerchief. They can be used in ways that are very, very serious and much easier to do. Chemical weapons, which also are incredibly deadly. If you've seen some of the photographs of what Secretary of Defense Cohen called Saddam's version of Madonna and Child, of some of the women and children that he used chemical weapons against in his own country. It's very heart-wrenching. And he continues also to have, we believe, certain missile capabilities which would give him the ability to launch these at long distances against countries in the region that we consider friends and allies.
Prior to the Gulf War, what was the United States' stance on Iraq?
Leading up to the Gulf War, we went through a period, which you described very well, in which we had tilted towards Iraq because we were so afraid of Iran. We believe this old expression that the enemy of my enemy is my friend.
Mm-hmm.
What we forgot was that the enemy of my enemy may still be my enemy too.
Mm-hmm.
And we did too much to tilt towards Saddam, including helping him develop some of these capabilities, not only the United States, but many of the Europeans as well. And so in a sense, we did do some things that helped create the problem that we have today.
I would just like to point out one thing about the biological weapons. The inspectors, they have zeroed in on that, I think, because they've verified and destroyed a lot of other weapons, but these particular weapons are unaccounted for. And so what they are trying to do now is solve that mystery and find those weapons. And the real question is whether he will let them into those sites. And that's what we won't know for a while.
It's interesting there, too. Some of the stuff we know was because Saddam's own son-in-law, back in 1994-95, defected and brought some of the information to the West.
Mm-hmm.
When he tried to go back to Iraq, Saddam simply greeted him by having him killed.
Wow. Well, I'm sorry, but that's all the time we have for this segment. When we come back, we'll be joined by two experts who feel that the United States' actions against Iraq have been excessive. So stay tuned for more Shades of Grey. Welcome back to Shades of Grey. I'm your host, Ronald Volsey. Tonight, we're exploring the crisis in Iraq. Joining me now for this segment are two experts on the subject who assert that the harsh tactics used by the United States are what have led to the current situation. Starting on my far right is Mark Brzezinski from the Committee on the Middle East, and next to him on my right is Omar Kura from the same organization. Thank you both very much for being here this evening. I'd like to start by giving you each a chance to explain how you're involved in the issue of Iraq. Let's start with you, Mr. Kura.
Hi, I'm Palestinian American. I've lived in different countries of the Middle East, and I've been a peace activist for a very long time now. And we have been concerned with the issue of Iraq. We've been hearing reports and reading about what has been going on in Iraq. Apparently, since the sanctions were applied on Iraq, over 1 million people have died. Over half of them are children. Every month, 4,500 child dies in Iraq because of malnutrition and the lack of medications. And we believe this situation would have not been reached to if it wasn't for U.S. foreign policy towards the Middle East.
Okay, Mr. Brzezinski, can you tell us how you're involved?
Sure. I went to the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton, studied international affairs, and during those years represented a student group at the UN, the International Student Movement for the UN. And that's when I got my introduction to world affairs, visiting 35 countries as a student. And since then, I've been to the Middle East 150 times. I represented the World Jewish Congress. I worked for the Smithsonian, the Woodrow Wilson Center. I've done consulting work for different organizations, including National Geographic and Congressional Quarterly. And in recent years, I'm the chairperson of the Committee on the Middle East, which is an organization of independent intellectuals at major universities in this country and elsewhere who are very much opposed to American policies and who don't believe the American people are told the truth about what those policies really are.
Okay. How would you say that U.S. actions in the past have led to the current situation in Iraq?
They haven't just led to it, they've created it. This is not about weapons of mass destruction. Weapons of mass destruction are all over the place. If there's any one country that has weapons of mass destruction, it's our ally Israel, which is 8 times more powerful militarily than all the Arab countries combined. And also the American people need to know that, for instance, your previous guest, who identified himself as a professor who's worked at the State Department, he mentioned the use of chemical weapons by Iraq. What he forgot to mention was that when those chemical weapons were used, Iraq was an ally of the United States. The weapons came from the United States and its allies, were paid for by the United States and its allies. And I might as well also mention the anthrax that we've been told about with the 5-pound bags that are being put out on the desk. The Secretary of Defense conveniently forgot to tell us that the original anthrax spores were bought not far from here in Rockville, Maryland, and sanctioned by the government of the United States and paid for by the government of the United States.
Okay. When, Mr. Kura, would you say that the United States relations in the Middle East first began to become tense?
We have to go far back to the end of World War II and how the Americans viewed the Middle East in general as they basically viewed it, the State Department, as a huge energy reserve, and whoever had control over it had great leverage on world affairs. And since that was their position, they did all that they could to keep their control in the region. So you had the United States giving money and arms to regimes, keeping them in power, and manipulating them in order for our ally, basically Israel, to remain dominant. For example, take the Iraq-Iran war. When Dr. Henry Kissinger was asked during the Iraq-Iran war what our policy was toward this crisis, he said, our policy is that they both lose. And indeed, after Iran came out weak, it was Iraq's turn to lose its power.
Okay, Mr. Brzezinski, what would be the effects of a U.S. military strike on Iraq?
We only have a few minutes. Let me just call it straight. Iraq is a devastated, destroyed country. Genocidal policies. These are not my words. These are the words of a former Attorney General of the United States, Ramsey Clark, who has publicly said that our policies are war criminal policies. Think of what it means to have 5% of your population killed in an 8-year period. Think of what it means to have no medicine, no food. The country is destroyed. What's involved here is a U.S.-Israeli domination process. And I stress the Israeli part because we're in Washington. People don't want to talk about that. People on Capitol Hill, people at the State Department, they don't want to tell the American people that this administration, more than any other, its strings are pulled by the Israelis, the Israeli Jewish lobby. I happen to be Jewish myself, and I represented the World Jewish Congress for many years here in Washington. But what we're dealing with right now is simply truth. We have an Assistant Secretary of State who wasn't even an American citizen at the time this president was elected, whose major job in Washington was to represent the Israeli Jewish lobby. And as a payoff to that lobby, he was given first a job at the National Security Council and then pushed into the State Department. This is domination of the region. It's not peace process, it's not equitable, it's not fair, and it's creating tremendous amounts of hate and desires for revenge.
So, what do you feel could be a feasible alternative to war for the United States if they wanted to control, weapons programs in Iraq?
The premise isn't quite right. The United States wants to control the region. Client regimes will be armed. Client regimes will be given not only arms but money. Regimes that do not cooperate with us will be either removed or their countries will be devastated. Now, the policy we should have in the region is a policy of understanding that the Arab peoples, just like the European peoples, the Asian peoples, and the American people, they want their freedom, they want their dignity, they want their independence, they want to be able to pursue economic welfare, they want their country. Iraq was the most developed country in the Arab world. This ruthless Ba'ath regime, because most of the regimes over there are ruthless, had put most of its money and resources into developing the country. A country that was in the forefront of the Arab world has now been pushed down 30 or 40 years.
Thanks. I'm sorry, but that's all the time we have for this segment. But when we come back, we'll bring out all four of our guests, and we're going to debate and discuss the issue. We'll also be taking phone calls from viewers at home. So if you have a question or a comment, call in 301-650-6472. You know the number. We look forward to your call. So stay tuned for more Shades of Grey. Good evening. Welcome back to Shades of Grey. I'm your host, Ronald Holsey. Tonight we're discussing the crisis in Iraq. Joining me now in the studio are all four guests from the first two segments. Starting at my far left from the University of California at Davis is Mr. Bruce Jenelson. Next to him on my left from the U.S. Senate is Chris Madison. On my far right is Mark Brzezinski. Next to him is Mr. Omar Kura, both from the Committee on the Middle East. Thank you all very much for being here. I'd also like to remind our viewers that the phone lines are open. Give us a call at 301-650-6472. We look forward to your comments and questions. I'd like to pose this question to maybe Mr. Jenelson. What exactly was agreed upon in the Kofi Annan agreement?
The agreement was to be a system for getting the UN inspectors in, which would hopefully allow us to get to the bottom of the problem. My fear, unfortunately, is that the agreement has been more about process than outcome. And so when some of the inspectors have gone to these presidential palaces, and surprise, surprise, there's been nothing there, and I mean like nothing there, and then the Saddam Hussein government turns around and says, you see, we really aren't doing this. They had 3, 4, 6 months to move these things any number of times. And so we're caught in a situation now in which it's really like trying to find, which shell it's under, because it's fairly convincing that these weapons and the things that go with them are still there.
Mr. Brzezinski, how do you feel about this agreement?
I think, like so many other things that are discussed in Washington, that's not the heart of the issue. There's a major arms race underway in the Middle East. Those countries that are American allies, those regimes that do what they're told, those regimes that enforce the rules, the American-Israeli rules in the region, are armed to the teeth. Those regimes that don't pursue American policies and that threaten Israeli policies. Of course, there's supposed to be a peace process going on, but conditions for the Palestinians are much worse now than before the peace process began. The Secretary General of the UN is not an independent actor. We learned only after his return that the Secretary of State made a secret visit to him on the weekend, gave him his marching orders. She was on the phone waking him up while he was there. Let's be candid about it. The UN has been, unfortunately, battered, abused. The Secretary General, the prior Secretary General, was essentially fired by the United States. Kofi Annan was essentially put in the job. It's nice for the American public, it's nice for the diplomats to pretend that something else is going on, but the realities are far, far bleaker than they are generally presented here.
I think it's important to remember that the original crisis in the Persian Gulf involved Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, two countries that are hardly puppets of Israel or the United Nations. I think that there is a
they're puppets of the United States.
Consensus that Saddam Hussein is a threat to his neighbors, and I think it's a distinct minority that would disagree with that proposition.
I'm Mark Brzezinski, your host for this weekly program, Mideast Realities, and thank you for watching. If you too are concerned about the situation in today's Middle East and about U.S. policies toward that crucial region of the world, and if you'd like to meet like-minded persons, why don't you come to one of our weekly social meetings? I'll be there, of course. Just give us a call for details.